Good afternoon to everybody. Today we have the second talk of Kristin Andrews. Sorry, we are very happy to have her here with us. She is a professor in the York University, and in these days he is also visiting professor at the University of Cagliari. Yesterday, she gave a talk with the topic norm psychology is pluralistic, and today there is a second talk. The topic is animal culture and animal welfare and norms also. So thank you, Kristin, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Giuseppe. It's been a pleasure continuing our discussions in these days. And so I changed my title a little bit in part to reflect the interests of the community that I am now in and to follow the norms, I believe, of the community I'm now in. So yesterday, if you were here, you heard me give a talk about norm pluralism in terms of psychology, where I'm looking at the different sorts of cognitive mechanisms that could support having norms. And I've made several hints yesterday to how this could be applied to the question of norms in animals. And so I'm turning to that topic today and introducing the idea of normative systems in animal cultures. Are we good? So it's okay. We took off, waiting room. Good. All right, so today we're going to be talking about the application of this view to the question of animal norms in animal cultures. So in most of the discussions that we have of animal cultures, for a very long time, this was a question that was met with a lot of skepticism, whether animals have cultures. It was thought to kind of reflect this romanticized view of animals as being somehow sophisticated beings with a lot of fancy sort of social structures. But in fact, what was of interest to scientists who are working on questions of animal cultures was something really quite simple. And the question of animal cultures came to be from the Japanese primatologists who noticed that the Japanese macaques of Koshima Island learned from a single individual that washing sweet potatoes in the salty water was somehow desirable. So this was socially learned from other members of the society. When these ideas were first presented in the West, they were met with some skepticism, and it took about 40 years for Western scientists to start being more open to the idea of animal cultures, with the publication of a paper at the turn of the century by a number of primatologists, chimpanzee researchers more specifically, where they found that there are differences in behaviors between chimpanzees in different communities that are not attributable to purely ecological or biological factors. And now, 20 years later, we have evidence of animal cultures found quite widely in species, not just in chimpanzees or whales and dolphins, but also in fruit flies, fish, and bumblebees. So with this question of culture in non-human wild animals, of course, we need to be specific about what is meant by culture in these conversations. And what the scientists have in mind when they describe culture is either just socially inherited patterns of behavior and information, or they have a more narrow definition, which would be socially transmitted patterns of behavior and information that are common to members of a group, but that differ between subpopulations of the same species. So some examples of behaviors along these lines is an image of nut cracking, which you see in some chimpanzee communities, but not all chimpanzee communities. And indeed, there are differences in how nuts are cracked in different chimpanzee communities, what sorts of hammers are used, whether a wedge is used under an anvil when nuts are cracked and so forth. We see behaviors that can be described as non-functional from a purely biological sense, like the Spatian trend of putting a piece of straw in the ear, which spread through a rehab community of chimpanzees after a high-ranking female started wearing this decorative object. And then the third image, you see hand clasp grooming, which was one of the earliest identified chimpanzee behaviors that's only seen in some communities where they're holding hands as they're grooming with one another. So these questions about culture in non-human wild animals that are pretty well established right now raises us or invites us to ask a question related to the talk of yesterday, whether in any of these cultures are there things that we can properly consider to be social norms? Are any of these cultures normative cultures? So just to remind you, what we have in mind when it comes to social norms. This is a slightly different definition from yesterday. But I chose this definition because discussions of social norms tends to focus almost entirely on human social norms, whether the norms are wonderfully riotous, like a Balinese ceremony, quotidian and banal, like greeting practices, or disturbing and worthy of change. Social norms are easiest to examine in human cultures because they're very easy for us to see in our own culture. But if other species have social norms and we don't pay attention to them, we risk losing a lot of sources of information about what social norms are and how to change them. And also importantly, for the purposes of this talk today, we lose opportunities to create situations for animals under our care that allow them to flourish better. And so it relates to questions about animal welfare for captive animals. And also social norms can relate to issues of conservation of wild animal populations. So it would only be beneficial to study animal social norms for these applications if they actually exist. And many people are skeptical that non-human animals have social norms. It's common to hear that only humans are normative agents with social norms. And this is where the definition comes into play. Dan Kelly says of social norms in 2020, he said, these are often informal rules that structure human behavior, regulating what is appropriate, required, prohibited, or permitted. Even this definition on its face presumes that social norms are human unique. Though this kind of innocent anthropocentrism simply reflects the current focus, and I think if Dan were to rewrite this essay today, he would get rid of the human. Though I think it's important to recognize it's not just that social norms in non-human animals have been overlooked, but some theorists explicitly deny it, identifying social norm development as, for example, the turning point in human evolution. So, for example, in Michael Tomasello's most recent book, The Evolution of Agency, Behavioral Organization from Lizards to Humans, he argues that only humans have normative agency, which involves social regulation in terms of reputation and obligation to others, shared intentionality, and the capacity for self-regulation. On his view, social norms only emerge once we get normative agents, and chimpanzees and lizards and squirrels, his other two model organisms in this book, lack this sort of agency. Another example, the other book on the slide, comes from Victor Kumar and Richmond Campbell's recent book, A Better Ape, The Evolution of a Moral Mind, which also just released last year. In this book, they suggest that great apes may have had what they call cooperative regularities, but not social norms. Kumar and Campbell suggest that this cooperative regularity that we see in non-human species might have become for our hominid ancestors a social norm once the group began to think of this cooperative regularity as, quote, the thing to do. So requiring a metacognitive sort of reflection on the behavior practice, something I critiqued yesterday. So these types of arguments for human uniqueness of social norms appeal to psychological and social capacities that are themselves often taken to be human unique. For example, Joseph Henrich thinks that quote, the secret to our success is the gene culture coevolution, which gave us a special norm psychology. And Jonathan Birch and Kim Sterelny have both argued that social norms evolved from cognitive control mechanisms that were originally used to create tools like stone hand axes by early hominins, and that these are unlikely to be found in other existing species, despite the fact there is quite complex technologies in, say, chimpanzee cultures, where chimpanzees can take years and years to develop correct techniques for ant tipping, for example. Despite the differences in these proposals, the views all take the position that humans are the only normative animal. And if these views are right and animals lack the prerequisite capacities for having social norms, then my proposal that we can learn more about norm emergence and norm change, and that we can usefully interact with questions about wild animal conservation and captive animal welfare will be non-starters. What I want to talk about today are two ways to counter the view that animals lack social norm. For one, we can take an individual level perspective and adopt the view that accept a proposal about the psychology that's sufficient for social norms and show that some species of animals have this norm psychology. And another move is to take a group level perspective, accept a proposal about the structure of the behavioral practices necessary for social norms, and show that some species have that behavioral practice. So what I want to do today is present both methods and then apply what we've learned from these two different methods to the kind of welfare implications that I have in mind. So the individual level perspective will be material that's I did not present yesterday, and the group level analysis is simply an application of the normative regularity view that I belabored yesterday and won't go into belaboring again, but we'll just briefly remind you what that is. So first with the individual level analysis. So there, as I mentioned yesterday, there's currently little agreement about the cognitive capacities necessary for normative cognition, whether you need representation and explicit discussion of rules or a sense of should, beliefs about beliefs, cognitive control models, or full-blown norm systems. These have all been proposed as potential requirements for having a norm capacity. And as I mentioned yesterday, that you have views like Kristin Cagliari's, which does suggest that in order for an individual to participate in a social norm, they have to have beliefs about the beliefs of other people in their communities. So given the ongoing debates in animal cognition, these sorts of requirements are very, very high, very heavy, and they might be so much that non-human animals, even non-human animals like chimpanzees, wouldn't be able to have them, given, for example, ongoing debates about the existence of theory of mind in chimpanzees. And when it comes to invertebrates, when it comes to social insects, we might be even more skeptical if we were starting from one of these positions that require this kind of heavy-duty cognitive machinery. So I want to say a bit more today about why we should be skeptical about requiring heavy-duty cognitive capacities for having social norms. And this comes from recognizing that there are lots of different varieties of social norms, even when we're just engaged with thinking about human behaviors. And some of these social norms do require sophisticated cognitive capacities, but many of them do not. And these kind that do not are the sorts that we often do not even recognize. Right? Many quotidian human social norms, such as sartorial norms, breeding norms, culinary norms, are had in the absence of anything like beliefs about the beliefs of others or meta representations of rules. And I've just on this slide presented a few examples of what some of these rules might look like. My favorite example is the invisible norms of proxemics. So the image on the slide here is an example of this view that was developed by Hall in 1966. He found that among suburban middle-class Anglophone white people in North America, the personal zone is 18 to 48 inches. If you stand closer than that to somebody that you don't know very well, you're going to feel quite uncomfortable. And you're not going to be able to identify how many centimeters or inches you need to stand away from one another, from someone, but you recognize when your personal space has been violated. This doesn't require theory of mind. Just like greeting practices, if you've always been raised in a society where you shake hands or hug to greet, you just do this and you don't have a second thought unless someone does it wrong. The same goes with how you eat. Like, do you use your hands, a fork and knife, a fork and spoon, chopsticks? Are you taking food from a dish and feeding it to your guests? As I was once fed in Morocco, which I found very surprising, but also charming. And these sorts of things. So violators of these kinds of social norms will pay social costs in this community. As you'll learn if you ever try to cheek kiss an Indonesian or snatch up and cuddle an Austrian infant that isn't a member of your family. Successful integration in the community often involves adopting at least some of the behavioral patterns of that community. So humans socially learn the quotidian patterns of their communities without noticing that they're learning things. And this kind of automatic social learning that comprises what we often just refer to as common sense is one way to acquire behavioral patterns that are, I think, commonly considered to be social norms or should be considered social norms. And these kinds of common sense norms I've called animal social norms. So it's on this slide, but I'm just going to flip over to this slide as well. So this comes from a paper I wrote in 2020, where I describe animal social norms as a kind of social norm that's had by humans, and I think non-human animals alike, that have a much lower cognitive requirement for having them. So we can capture this idea of an animal social norm through a de-intellectualized version of Kristin Cagliari's account, so that there's a pattern of behavior that's demonstrated by community members, that individuals from that community choose to conform to the pattern of behavior. And by choose, what I really have in mind here is that the behavior is flexible, that it's not an automatic fixed action pattern or something like that. And finally, that individuals expect that community members will also conform to the behavior. And finally, that they will sanction individuals who don't conform. Kristin Cagliari's proposal is that the beliefs about others' beliefs are required at clause C, and that commitment is grounded in what is often taken to be a function for theory of mind, namely the ability to predict what others are going to do. So while predicting behavior is indeed an important part of the practice of social norms, theory of mind is not needed for predicting behavior, as there are many other methods for humans and other animals to predict behavior, as I mentioned yesterday and argued in my 2012 book. So in addition, none of this requires anything like meta-representation of rules or scrutinizing or endorsing rules. This refers to the kind of psychological capacities that I think are widely had in cultural animals. So I'm sorry that the slide is so small for those of you in the actual room. It's probably much better on Zoom. But naive normativity is what I'm calling the cognitive capacities that are required on this individualistic view. And what naive normativity consists of are a combination of 4 capacities. One is the capacity to identify something as an agent, which is what's needed to be a folk psychologist as well. Sensitivity to in-group, out-group differences, and the capacity to socially learn group traditions. So all of those are already had in culture. Once you've got animal culture, you've got those first 3 categories. What naive normativity adds is the responsiveness to appropriateness. And responsiveness to appropriateness can be cashed out in a variety of ways. It could be cashed out in terms of an effective response to a violation of a norm, surprise when an individual acts against the behavioral pattern, or it could be understood in terms of the sorts of things I talked about yesterday, punishment or modeling the correct behavior, depending on whether you're in a pedagogical situation or not. And so I think that these are very minimal cognitive requirements and should allow us to find pretty broad evidence of animal social norms in other species. And so I want to give you some examples of where I think we might find these sorts of things. I do want to warn you, the next picture is a picture of a chimpanzee eating an infant chimpanzee. If that's not something you want to see, Don't look at the slides. So this was a photo taken from a report that Nishi and Nakamura published in 2017. Chimpanzee infanticide and cannibalism is something that happens. It's very rare, but when it happens, it's only rarely been actually observed and reported. So this is one of the few reports that we have, because this rareness suggests that there might be a norm against infanticide in chimpanzee infants, because adult chimpanzees typically tolerate infants who climb on them, who steal food from them, and basically act with impunity. Observational reports of male aggression towards infants describe unrelated females staging massive protests, screaming, barking, and even attempting to intervene, protecting the infant from the male. These are cases that don't result in an infanticide incident, but are successfully repairing the pattern. Rudolf von Rohr and colleagues have done a number of studies on and reviewed evidence about these kinds of behaviors that have been observed. And it suggests that the aggressive behavior demonstrated by the male may be a violation of an impunity of infants norm, and that the female reaction is a sanction of a norm violation. So we don't yet have high confidence in the existence of a norm against mishandling infants on this model, because we don't yet have evidence that the behavioral pattern was socially learned in this case, which I have as a requirement for an animal social norm. And we don't have evidence that the sanction was socially learned. And we also don't really have evidence that the sanction is in fact a sanction of a norm, as opposed to a bunch of individuals who individually don't like what the male is doing right now. So this is kind of like all of the individuals, I think it was Searle's example of all the individuals running under the roof of the train station when it's raining without doing it together. So I think that it's suggestive, but it's not yet, we don't yet have enough evidence. But these are the sorts of cases where we can study and we can look at long-term behavior. So I had written to Nishi and Nakamura after they published this report and said, how is the male who ate this infant treated in the subsequent hours and days? And they said, we don't know, we didn't have that data. I said, how are the other individuals acting when he was hunting and killing the infant? They said, it was like a monkey hunt. Everyone was up in arms and screaming and running around, and we couldn't capture any data. It was just chaos. It was also raining. They could barely see what was going on. And just describe it as this massive, chaotic event. But taking opportunistic data when you see incidents like this would be the sort of thing we would need in order to gain evidence that there was something like a sanction going on by the other individuals in the community. And taking data in the hours and days afterward to see how the male is treated. Maybe more deferential, right? Maybe they're afraid of him because he violated this norm, or maybe maybe he loses some power because of his violation. These are the kinds of questions we have to have. Now, even if we would define this kind of data that I've suggested, there's still a psychological objection that is naturally made that comes from people like Tomasello and Cagliari, that it's not the psychology of the right kind that we have here. There's minimal psychology, but we don't have evidence of, say, shared intentionality. As you might recall, on my account of an animal social norm, shared intentionality was not one of the requirements there. It was Margaret Gilbert's example of strangers hurrying to the shelter to get out of the rain. Yeah, maybe that's what was going on here. And so the general objection can be stated like this: a true social norm only exists when members of a community share a certain psychological state. So any attempt to operationalize norms the way we do will ultimately fail to identify instances of social norms in a society. For Tomasello, shared intentionality is required. For Cagliari, it's this normative expectation that requires theory of mind. Without these particular states, what looks like a norm is merely some kind of a pattern of behavior, one might object. So if we're only interested in the question of whether some animal species have social norms, we might just accept the kind of requirements that Cagliari and Tomasello give us and just address it head on and say, here's some evidence of theory of mind, or let's say instead of theory of mind, predicting ability, and let's see some evidence of shared intentionality against Tomasello. And while I don't want to belabor the point, because this is not the approach that I want to push forward, I can't just pass up the opportunity to, as a side note, point out that there's a lot of evidence of shared intentionality in great ape species, in non-human great ape species. Current research provides evidence that chimpanzees work together to achieve goals, right, including papers that Tomasello is an author, a co-author on, provides evidence of this. There's evidence that chimpanzees will share, that they help one another, that they have group-specific practices, that they anticipate the behavior of chimpanzees who have different perceptual information from one another, and that they do past versions of the false belief task. And I've argued that this body of research as a whole suggests that apes have a kind of folk psychology in the 2012 book, and more recently argued with Dennis Papadopoulos, who's my PhD student, that this is evidence that apes demonstrate shared intentionality. So even if we were to take this really narrow requirement, I think that like the apes would be okay, but I'd worry about the ants and other animals that I think we shouldn't. So we shouldn't go this route of the Tomasello sort of route. I think that there's another and better way to respond to this kind of objection, and that is by challenging the idea that social norms require any of these psychological capacities in all instances. The individual framework that I'm laying out here permits the discovery of some kinds of social norms in animals, given evidence of the appropriate sort, right? But it has its limitations, including the animal social norms that I've proposed, as it may underestimate the variety of norm types that exist. For any particular capacity, be it social learning, shared intentionality, theory of mind, there are some human social norms that don't require those capacities. And I worry that myself, as well as Tomasello and Cagliari, are guilty of anthropofabulation, what Cameron Buckner calls anthropofabulation. Which is this idea, which is an error that combines confabulating the human cognitive capacities and then requiring animals to have those capacities in order for them to qualify as being able to do something. So it's a double mistake. The point is that not all human social norms involve beliefs about others' beliefs or about intentions. They don't need to think about, right, others' beliefs in right, lots of the quotidian sorts of cases I've already described. But you also perhaps don't need to socially learn social norms. One might think you do need to socially learn social norms, but as I already alluded to yesterday, some social norms, like a norm against incest, is something that might be biologically inherited, or norms about caring for offspring might be biologically inherited. Now, how we go about realizing those norms, what does it mean to provide good infant care, or how we identify someone as someone we're related to that we shouldn't have sex with, are going to be culturally dependent. But these kind of basic groundings for these sorts of social norms might not be themselves socially learned. And so I want to say that the framework for investigating animal social norms generally, if that's our goal, this kind of individual psychological approach has its limits. It can be used as a positive test, and so it's a tool for examining social norms in other species, but relying on it alone risks underestimating the extent to which social norms exist in other species. I mean, in a sense, it's like a COVID test, right? Like you take a COVID test and it's positive, you're like, oh shoot, okay, too bad. But if it's negative, like don't get too confident. You might still have it and it might just not be detected. And I think animal social norms are a bit like that. So because of this, I also went on to develop with Evan Westra this idea of a normative regularity, which I discussed in quite some detail yesterday. So as you may recall, a normative regularity is a socially maintained pattern of behavioral conformity within a community. The really strong requirement here is the social maintenance of the behavioral pattern. The behavioral pattern might be acquired through social learning or through biological inheritance. None of that matters, but what matters is that when there are violations, the violations are responded to, and individuals might be nudged or explicitly told or modeled to get back into the pattern. And individuals, as they're learning the pattern, be them young individuals for new members of the community or immigrants who are coming into the community, they're somehow supported to acquire these patterns of behavior as well. And so we can use this construct in order to investigate candidate normative regularities in non-human animals. So again, like the animal social norm, the individual approach, we don't yet have robust evidence of these in non-human species. It hasn't been a question of investigation, but there are a lot of suggestive cases for the existence of them in primate species and in other species as well. But I've been focusing on the question of primates with a group of primatologists. So here on the slide are just a number of domains where we might be looking for potential normative regularities. Things like, as I already discussed, a kind of infant care, cooperative care, and then practices, very specific practices like weaning in infants. This is kind of difficult time for a mother and an infant when the infant is wanting to continue nursing and the mother says, get away. And there's oftentimes described by primatologists observing these, a negotiation between the mother and the infant to get that weaning process off the ground. Things like this. There's also Japanese primatologists have described at the other end social norms that might exist in the response and treatment of elders, the kind of deference that they have observed in the treatment of older chimpanzees in the community, helping and the kind of epistemic expertise that's sometimes granted to elder members. I find it very interesting that this is, I've only read about this from Japanese primatologists. The European primatologists and North American primatologists never mentioned anything about special norms around elder care and appreciation. And then there are lots of other sorts of norms I have here on the table. Sex is one that is of a lot of interest, the kind of sex roles for males and females, access to sex partners. There's some descriptions of bonobo females who expect that they should be able to get sex from individuals, and when they don't, they have temper tantrums that seem to be more than just like, this is something I want and I didn't get what I want, but are interpreted by the researchers as, this is what I deserve as given my standing in society, and you're not giving me, not honoring my standing. So these norms are not always going to be like human norms at all. So these kinds of candidate social norms, just a couple of examples that I want to describe, come from the sorts of immigrant behavior. I think that when you've got species like, say, vervet monkeys, where you have immigration after sexual maturity, and an immigrant moves from one culture to another culture, in order for this culture to sustain itself, the immigrants have to learn the new behavior. So that means they have to give up an old behavior that they've learned in their natal groups and then conform to this new behavior. And one of the most interesting studies on this was done by Erica Vanderwall and colleagues. And it was a bit of an accidental study because they were just looking at food preferences and whether these were inherited from a mother to an infant. And they were, easily enough. What they did is they took 4 communities of free-ranging vervet monkeys. They provisioned all 4 of these communities with corn that was dyed pink or blue. And in 2 of the communities, the blue corn was treated with quinine when it was first presented, so it was very bitter, not palatable. In the other 2 communities, the pink corn was treated with quinine. And so you got these food preferences that the mothers developed, or the whole community developed, and the animals were continuing to be provisioned with these kinds of food, but the quinine was taken away. And then when infants were born into this community, they just conformed to what the community was doing. Simple enough. Now, what was interesting is when the males reached sexual maturity and immigrated. Very luckily, the males from the pink corn eating groups moved to the blue corn eating groups and vice versa. And what happened was that all but one of the males switched their preferences. They conformed to the new group. Now, from a biological perspective, this makes no sense at all because you have a resource that is not being contested. You have calories that can be freely gained, and you know it's good for you because you've been eating it your whole life. And yet they stop eating it in order to conform to the community. So what we don't know is what the rewards are that are associated with this sort of behavior. Are the individuals who conform to the behavior having more successful immigrations than individuals who aren't? In the study, there was only one individual that didn't conform to their new in-group. And interestingly, that individual became the alpha of the community right away. So this raises questions as well about what's going on with this behavioral pattern. Another incident that was recorded and studied was a case of chimpanzees at the Royal Burger Zoo in the Netherlands. So this is a video I'm showing you from the study showing this traditional cultural behavior in this community. It's called the cross-armed walk. The females engaged in this walk, other members of the community, the males didn't do it. As you can see, as you're doing a cross-armed walk, you're not walking very efficiently. You're very slow. You're only using 3 legs, and others can walk much faster on 4 legs. And so the behavior has no adaptive value, and it's costly. There's no obvious functional reason for it. So in the I don't remember when, but at one point, 2 female chimpanzees were introduced into this community of chimpanzees, and Moni and Erica. And Moni, one of these 2 immigrants, immediately started to perform the cross-armed walk that she saw demonstrated just 2 days after she was introduced. Erica, on the other hand, never was observed to do the cross-armed walk. So given the stark difference in the 2 chimpanzees, the authors wanted to do a social embeddedness analysis to see which of these, whether there's any difference in the social integration of these 2 individuals into the community. And they found, unsurprisingly, that Moni was significantly better and integrated than Erica. So the conforming individual was better integrated. Now, again, what we don't know is whether the cross-armed walk is a normative regularity, whether there were any social maintenance of this walking behavior. What we really want to know is whether the other animals responded right away to her doing the cross-armed walk, how they responded them differently as this integration was happening over time. And so if we were to do a study on a normative regularity in this community, we would be recording data over time after the introduction of new animals. In this case. And another example, which I won't go into much detail with, is the treatment of infants and kind of the sort of training that sometimes happens with infants. I mentioned yesterday the sorts of treatment of infants where they learn how, like as a infant male becomes a juvenile male, as they learn what they can't do with females anymore. But other sorts of examples that are described are stick use behavior. So in Cagliari National Park, we've got examples of monkeys who are carrying sticks and seem to have no reason for carrying them. You treat them like they're infants or something. But in other chimpanzee communities, stick use is not happening at all. And even infants who are playing with sticks have been observed to have the sticks taken away from them. So these are all suggestive examples, and we don't have yet any clear evidence that behavioral patterns have been maintained. And at this point, dedicated research on normative regularities in other species is going to be required. This is something that we're working on right now with a large group of scholars. But I think that these sorts of things are illustrative and suggestive enough for us to say, well, what are the implications of there being social norms in non-human animals? What can it tell us about things like norm change across species? And we might have reasons to want to change animal norms in different species. So, of course, the primary goal of norm change is to modify behavioral patterns. And when we think about changing human norms, we are thinking about, right, changing, when we're thinking about changing human behavior, we're thinking about changing human norms. But when we're thinking about changing animal behavior, we often don't think about it in terms of changing animal norms because we often aren't thinking about animal norms. But this actually might be a very useful tool to support things like our conservation goals, which are often really focused on modifying animal behavior. Things like creating fences to keep dogs out of sensitive habitat in city parks. We're using fireworks or bee fences to scare elephants from fruit plantations, or building green corridors to allow turtles to cross roads, and allowing chimpanzees to immigrate from patchy habitat are all examples of attempts to modify animal behavior. And these interventions all enjoy a varying degree of success. And recently, it's been argued that conservation strategies can be supported by understanding the culture of wild animals. Culture in this context refers to, right, socially transmitted patterns of behavior or information that are socially learned. And there are a number of strategies to support various conservation efforts, which are going to rely on animal culture and potential social norms. So, for example, conservationists might be strategic in selecting cultural subpopulations for special protection, given their particular strengths at weathering environmental change caused by anthropogenic climate change, things like that, or habitat destruction, right, preserving the hardiest versions of the species, one might think. Or knowledge of traditional migration routes could be essential for preserving habitat access and understanding how animals learn strategies for cooperating from other group members, and how to disrupt that kind of social learning so you don't have, say, young elephants starting to raid fruit plantations as well. What sort of social learning interventions can you devise to change this sort of behavior? So social norms, of course, differ from cultural traditions by not specifying how the behavioral patterns are acquired and by adding the requirement that the pattern is socially maintained. Given the social maintenance aspect of social norms, if conservationists want to modify a behavior supported by social norms, it's going to be important to identify the pattern as a norm and to determine how the pattern is being socially maintained by the group members. So, for example, if it turns out that elephant crop raiding were a social norm and that raiding gardens conferred prestige on young elephants and were kind of a rite of passage, then conservations could study the population and see if there are other sorts of risky behavior that elephants could it be encouraged to engage in instead that confers the same sort of prestige or rite of passage that's needed for them to be accepted as an adult or a potential leader or important community member. In the case of human-wildlife conflict that are supported by social maintenance, thinking about changing animal norms the same way we think about changing human norms might offer some really innovative methods for interventions. And then I want to say a little bit more then about the how normative regularities and social norms might support captive animal welfare. Interactions between human caretakers and captive animals might create normative regularities. Regularities around things like speeding, treatment by caretakers, and so on. And we can damage these communities when we violate these norms and these expectations. Culture in captive animals is something that's only beginning to be explored. And I think it's really important to recognize that in a lot of these kind of captive situations, whether it's an ecotourism resort like St. Anthony's Key, where I spent 2 weeks ago with the field course, working with these dolphins, or whether it's a place like the multi-species vine sanctuary, where you have farmed animals who are living together in a multi-species community, or a lab like the Yale Monkey Lab, where you have a bunch of monkeys who are hanging out with humans and living with them. These are all cultures of a sort, because once you've got a cultural animal and you put them together, they're going to be creating culture. I mean, that is what cultural animals do. And if they're normative animals, they're going to be creating norms and expectations, because that's what normative animals do. Some of these kinds of social norms are really going to be important to inform our goals on animal welfare policy, I think. And so we can look at, first of all, what sorts of culture and norms might we find in some of these captive animal situations, and we can ask questions about ways in which we should expect where culture and norm would impact the well-being of captive animals. And so 3 examples of places where we expect to see this. This is something Simon Fitzpatrick and I have worked on, is having sociality of the right kind can be really important for flourishing in captive animal societies, as opposed to just having social contact. You might have to have the right kind of social contact. You might have to have opportunities to construct culture. So you might need objects that you can manipulate, that others can observe you manipulate, and that you can then manipulate as well. And you might have to recognize the kind of epistemic sources that exist in your community as well. And as you're managing populations and moving animals around, be very sensitive to what sorts of epistemic loss you might be introducing in the community when you move an individual out of the way. So just as a couple of brief examples of the kind of ideas we had with the right kind of sociality, is that when you're talking about learning a social pattern, whether it is a cultural pattern or whether it's a normative pattern, sometimes you need the right kind of model. Maybe you need mothers, maybe you need same-age peers, maybe you need a same-sex non-parent adult to learn from. So one example of this sort of same-sex non-parent adult learning that's been identified is in African elephants, where Bates and al. Described this false estrus behavior in adult females. So there's this kind of sexy walk that adult female elephants engage in when they're in estrus to attract the males and let them know they don't have the big puffy genitals chimpanzees do to signify when they're ready to mate, so they do the sexy walk. But this appears to be something that is socially learned, and that unrelated adult females will demonstrate the sexy walk to the young females in the community when they perceive that it's the right time for them to start soliciting sex from males. So that's just one example of where it might be really important to have this kind of sociality of a certain kind. If you don't have an individual like that, a same-sex non-parent adult who can teach you this, you might miss out on developing the skill that might be really important for our welfare goals and sustaining the population, whether it's captive or wild. And then the second point I made is this need for culture. A lot of the work with captive animals is focused on, welfare work is focused on enrichment, introducing objects for play into a community. And this often focuses just on mental enrichment for individuals, so an individual puzzle box or like a fake fruit that needs to be manipulated in order to gain food from inside of it. These are all very individualistic and not so many opportunities for cultural enrichment objects, where you've got multi-individuals who can work on an object together to cooperate on objects. There's some studies where they've introduced these kinds of devices into enclosures. So where one individual pushes a switch and then it makes juice come out of the fountain somewhere else, or you need multiple individuals to pull on something at the same time. These are often just introduced for study and then taken out of the enclosures, not allowed to become part of the environment for the animals. But having these opportunities to get the animals to cooperate if they want to cooperate, right? If you look at a typical zoo and there aren't a lot of opportunities for animals to cooperate, and then you test them on cooperation and see that they don't cooperate, it tells you very little about whether those animals can cooperate or not, because they've not had these opportunities. And so what we can do is allow these objects to exist in the environment, or give multiple iterations of an object, like lots of rice bags, throw that into an enclosure to see if there's a trend that emerges. One individual starts wearing it as a shirt. Is this going to be something others want to copy as well, or will they elaborate on these sorts of behaviors for increased welfare? And then finally, this kind of epistemic costs. one thing that we found right now is that there's been a lot of costs that are associated with changing community compositions, which is a typical part of managing populations of captive animals, right? For genetic diversity or what have you, moving animals around. And when we remove older individuals who have knowledge about a rare or less frequent events, things like death or seasonality or caregiver turnover, then this might have significant impact on the overall functioning of the group, right? So if a beloved caregiver leaves and an individual is seeing caregivers come and go before, and someone's really sad, they might be able to, right, for example, treat that individual with something like empathy or help them deal with this change of a beloved caregiver or something like that. And there's evidence that when we reintroduce animals into natural settings, this kind of lack of information can really impact their ability to survive in these kinds of contexts, because they haven't learned the kind of information that they need. There are also these studies, a couple of studies on here, about how housing dairy calves in social groups increases their weaning weights. And what's suggested is that they're learning how to graze. And this kind of information is really important. So if you don't have this kind of opportunity to learn from experts about how to graze, you're going to have these populations that at least are not going to support our agricultural goals as well, like this. And so our current animal welfare policy, I think, sometimes gets a bit wrong about animal well-being, because the focus is on things like what you see of the World Organization for Animal Health's Terrestrial Animal Health Code, where they say an animal experiences good welfare if the animal is healthy, comfortable, well-nourished, safe, not suffering from unpleasant states such as pain, fear, and distress, and is able to express behaviors that are important for its physical and mental state. I mean, basically what this means is that there's food and medicine and you can move around a little bit. This is like, imagine this for a human, like we say, this is enough for children to flourish. It would be pretty horrifying. There's also tensions with the UK Farm Animal Welfare Council's 5 freedoms, right? Again, like freedom from hunger and thirst, discomfort, pain, freedom to express normal behavior, freedom from fear and distress. But if you look at these sorts of things like culture and discomfort, fear and distress, discomfort, fear and distress is part of culture, it's part of life. Like a world without any discomfort or fear or distress is boring, is super boring. And so when you've got things like dominance fighting, that's going to be some distress. When you've got behaviors that maybe look to a caregiver to be problematic, like pacing or other stereotypies, this might be in fact a way of coping with a very harmful environment, right? So like think about children in schools who want to climb under the table or cover their ears because they have sensory issues. And before sensory issues were really recognized in our cultures, the kids were forced to take their hands off their ears and sit on the desk, and they were going crazy from this. And now it's recognized that these are behaviors that they need to cope with their situation. These sorts of things can be really important as part of cultural animals and be against welfare interests if we don't permit them. Also, if you just look at things like culture and the importance of culture with pain and injury and disease, there's some things that we do culturally that's really risky disease-wise, right? So not wearing a mask, for example, in this room is somewhat risky, maybe not that risky right now, but it's something that we've decided as a culture we don't need to do anymore, and we're willing to take these sorts of risks. There are other things that we do that are risky that we've done forever, things that are really disgusting, like open our mouths really wide and stick our tongues into each other's mouths. That's really disgusting, right? It's a great way to spread pathogens. And yet it's something that's extremely important to human culture. The way this eyeball poking capuchin monkey behavior has been described as something that's like testing pair bonds and trusting one another by making yourself quite vulnerable to other individuals. If this sort of behavior gets stopped in a captive situation because it's risky or harmful, then you might be destroying a cultural behavior and stopping the community from developing a culture. Other sorts of examples would be things like feces eating in communities of chimpanzees, which you see happening in some communities. And it's been argued by some primatologists that this should be supported, even though, again, you've got a pathogen risk here. But it might be more important for the group to take this risk of the pathogens and still have this behavior that is something that is shared and unique to them, and that other individuals develop. Just because we find it gross doesn't mean that it's bad and harmful for them. And then this idea about normal behaviors being really important. It's not just normal behaviors that that we see as being potentially cultural behaviors, but in this these orangutans of Camp Leakey, what now is cultural behavior for them is acting like a kind of a human. This Camp Leakey was formed by Barute Galdikas, and it's a place, orangutan kind of rehab center where the orangutans started really getting integrated with the human cultures. And my colleague Ann Russin, who spent many years researching there, said it's like walking into the cantina scene of Star Wars, because you see all of these orangutans like paddling boats and washing clothes and lighting fires and siphoning gas and doing all of these sorts of things. So is this a problem? It's a different, very different kind of culture. Is this something that should be stopped and is problematic in this group? I think only if we have this kind of simplistic view about what counts as natural, and we think about culture as something that stops and doesn't change, and that's the only sort of acceptable culture. And so if we think about welfare beyond things like the 5 freedoms, we see things like the importance of cultural capacities, and the ability to develop cultural capacities in other species. And I'll just end here by pointing out that just like we have introduced dogs into our homes and we've changed wild dogs' behavior very dramatically through our interactions with dogs and allowing dogs to develop a culture that's shared with humans. And that seems to be fine for most people. When we talk about chimpanzees in captivity or dolphins in captivity and changing them, or the orangutans in Camp Leakey and changing their cultural behaviors, people sometimes get very uneasy about this and say it would be better for us to not let them reproduce and end these cultures rather than allowing them to exist. And if we'd have done that with dogs, we wouldn't be having these families with dogs in them. We would have made a judgment about some cultures not being worthy of preserving. And in the human, I didn't put the slide in, but in the human context, the UN has declared that human culture is of value and ought to be preserved. And so we have these programs to preserve, different cultural languages and to bring back these dying languages, which we see all across Europe and a little bit in indigenous languages in North America. And if we look at the arguments for those, parallel arguments can be made for preserving the range of cultures and non-human animal species as well. And so I think that there are some important consequences for rethinking what counts as culture and other places to find social norms in non-human animal species, and what kind of policy implications might come from these. So thanks for your attention, and thanks to all of my collaborators on these projects. And yeah, you guys. Okay.